Go ahead, Brad.
Can we pick up from yesterday on Ukraine?
Sure.
Yesterday, you decried what you said were incursions and, for all intents and purposes, an apparent invasion. That looks all too real today, and the action has gotten much more serious with direct contact between Russian and Ukrainian forces. What are you going to do about it? Because you didn't really outline anything specific you were going to do yesterday.
Well, let me first say that what we're seeing, not just over the last couple of days, but certainly weeks and even months, is a pattern of escalating aggression in Ukraine from the Russians and Russian-backed separatists. It's clear that Russia has not only stepped up its presence in eastern Ukraine and intervened directly with combat forces, armored vehicles, artillery, and surface-to-air systems, and is actively fighting Ukrainian forces, as well as playing a direct supporting role to the separatist proxies and mercenaries. I know you're aware of that, but I wanted to repeat it. In terms of what we are considering, we have a range of tools at our disposal. There are ongoing discussions within the administration. There was an emergency meeting of the OSCE in Vienna today, and the UN Security Council will meet this afternoon in New York. So there are several different channels, all of which the United States is engaged with, that are having discussions about what the options are. We have, of course, put in place a range of sanctions that have had a significant economic impact in Russia. We have additional tools and sanctions that we could certainly choose to put in place. Next week is an opportunity, of course, to discuss this at NATO, which I just announced the Secretary will, of course, be attending. It's not until then. I expect if the Secretary is asked, or if it is useful for him to make calls, he will certainly do that through the course of the weekend as well.
Among the options, one that this administration hasn't entertained yet, or hasn't done yet, has been military aid to Ukraine. Is that something you are willing to consider now that Russia has escalated it this far?
Well, our focus remains on non-lethal assistance. We have provided a range of non-lethal assistance, as has a number of other countries in Europe. We have not ruled out options. Obviously, there are a range of requests that we have and that the National Security Council team can certainly consider, but I have no updates or predictions for you at this point.
And then another thing that the foreign minister said today was he asked that Russian assets, it sounded, all or almost all, be frozen. Is that something you're looking at among the range of options you'd consider?
Well, without knowing the specifics, I saw his comments, but without knowing the specifics of his plan, or his ask, I should say, I would note that we have frozen some assets. Obviously, when an individual is put on a sanctions list, that's part of what happens, right? Depends on the specific case. Beyond that, the discussions we're having are, of course, not only through the OSCE and through the UN and through many of our partners around the world, but also with the Ukrainians about what the most effective steps are. We've seen those comments. I don't have additional details, so I don't have any analysis for you.
I'll just ask one more.
Okay, go ahead.
Given that yesterday I think you said that we're basically talking about the same range of options we were several months ago, maybe in different form or in more heightened state. What efficacy have these brought so far? You've talked about economic impact, but nothing seems to be changing Putin's behavior. So what would you hope to accomplish?
Well, Brad, as we've increased our sanctions, both the United States and European sanctions, we've seen an increasing impact on the Russian economy. And that's been on not only the exit of capital flow, it's been on the growth projections, and this is something that could deeply impact the people of Russia. That is certainly not our goal or intention, but President Putin has a choice to make about whether he cares about the economic impact on his people or not. And what we're seeing, the point I'm making, is that the impacts have been escalating and increasing as we have increased them as well. That's why we continue to do more and why we're considering doing more.
But just, the people of Ukraine don't want Vladimir Putin to have a choice. The choice as you're presenting it is he can carve up Ukraine and suffer an economic cost, or he could not carve up Ukraine and not suffer that economic cost. But other countries around the world, don't get that choice, that they don't have the right to conquer countries at a cost. I mean, why haven't you posed it differently?
To be clear, what I mean by choice is President Putin can determine, could decide, and the Russians could decide to follow their words with actions and work with the Ukrainians to put in place a ceasefire, to take steps to pull back the separatists, to take steps to bring back the military equipment and individuals. That's a choice they have. If they take that choice, obviously that would impact the actions that we take and that the Europeans take as well.
Here's the thing, you talked about how the United States and its partners have imposed escalating sanctions on Russia, and how these have increasingly had an impact on capital flight and growth projections and so on. At the same time, you point out that you have seen a pattern of escalating aggression on the part of Russia in Ukraine. So it seems clear that your economic sanctions policy, whatever it may have had on the economy, has not had any impact on Russia's thinking. If anything, by your own words, they have escalated their aggression over time. What makes you think that any level of economic sanctions is going to get Russia to change its mind on invading and supporting separatists in Ukraine?
Well, Arshad, it's hard for us to predict what President Putin will do, and I know you're not asking me to do that, but I think the challenge, or I think one of the factors here is certainly how these sanctions impact the Russian people and impact the economy in Russia and impact how businesses are functioning. And certainly our preference is not to continue to escalate sanctions. Our preference is for Russia and President Putin to make a decision about pulling back and de-escalating. So again, as this increases, it becomes more and more of a significant choice that President Putin has to make about whether the future and the impact on his own country is more important than his desire to take escalatory actions into Ukraine.
Given that it hasn't worked so far, why should it work in the future?
Well, I think, Arshad, as you've seen, there have been times where there has been some engagement, there has been some pullback, there has been ups and downs in this process, what we've seen. There's been an escalatory actions that have certainly grown over time, as you referenced.
As you said.
And I said, and I said as well. We think that this is the most effective tool, the best tool. A military solution is not what we think is the appropriate approach, and so we're taking every tool we can to see if we can reach a conclusion here through diplomatic means.
So you said, sorry, just a couple more on this, you said that the NATO summit in Wales would provide an occasion to discuss this issue. And I think German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said that the Europeans plan to discuss the possibility of additional sanctions. Is it reasonable then to assume that the United States will not impose any additional sanctions until it's consulted next week with its partners at the NATO meeting?
I don't want to make a prediction. Obviously, we have that ability to. We've done it in lockstep with the Europeans at every point in this process, and I expect that will continue. That doesn't mean it's taken place on the exact same day or in the exact same form. But I don't have any predictions for you on the timing of any additional sanctions or if there will be additional sanctions.
And if Russia's, I mean, yesterday you used the word incursions, but I think even a NATO spokesman is quoted today as saying that they estimate that there are 1,000 Russian military personnel operating in eastern Ukraine now. I mean, is there nothing more the West can do beyond economic sanctions that so far have been completely ineffective to try to prevent one country from invading and destabilizing another?
Well, certainly we have a range of tools at our disposal. I think beyond the economic sanctions, we've also provided a great deal of non-lethal assistance that has included some equipment that's been helpful as well to the Ukrainians. We've also been working closely with them on the political front. We've been engaged with our European partners on that effort. So it hasn't been one step or one lever we've been pulling. We've been working on several different tracks.
Well, why shouldn't the Russians conclude that since you're clearly not willing to do anything militarily to try to stop this, and you're not even willing to arm with lethal assistance the Ukrainians, that they can essentially continue to destabilize eastern Ukraine with impunity, just as they invaded and subsequently annexed Crimea, and that there is no significant short, medium, or long-term effect on them?
The United States and the international community has been clear through actions that we will not hold back in putting in place punitive measures that we do feel will have an impact over the long term. And we've seen some impacts over the course, not just economic impacts at time, but impacts in behavior at times as well. Now, obviously, this is not going to be resolved until Russia pulls back their presence, until separatists pull back, until arms are no longer going into Ukraine. But we're going to take a range of steps. We're continuing to work at this. This will be a discussion with the international community, but it hasn't changed the fact that our preference and our priority and our focus is on non-lethal assistance and is on a diplomatic path forward.
What is the size of the invasion force? Do you have any idea of the size of the invasion force? Because somebody was saying like there were 4 or 8 armored personnel carriers and so on, but maybe you have a better idea.
There have been a range of numbers out there, and different numbers out there. I don't have anything to confirm for you.
But it's not a massive invasion. I mean, it's not of the size of division or something like this.
There are many ways to define that, Saeed. I would just say there are a range of numbers out there. I don't have anything new from the United States specifically to
And I
confirm
guess
for
a
you.
quick follow-up on the military assistance. Do you know if Ukraine's armament, are they strictly Russian or locally produced, or do they get any kind of military aid from other countries in Western Europe?
I don't have an accounting of their military equipment. I would point you to them to ask them
I'm
for
saying
that.
if you start supplying them with Western arms or American arms, they would probably need a great deal of training, wouldn't they?
Well, anytime, broadly speaking, that you, it depends on what the equipment is and what any country has and what it's required. If you know with Iraq, there are specific. But again, I'm not going to get into hypothetical because that isn't a decision that's been made. Roz, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about military options since you said that nothing has been taken off the table. Given that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, what is the U.S.'s security relationship with Ukraine? Is there a security agreement between the two countries, mutual defense? What's the status, the legal status of the U.S.'s obligation to Ukraine? Are you able to say?
I really would point you to the Department of Defense. Obviously, they're not a NATO ally. We have obviously been clearly very supportive of their efforts, been helping them in a range of manners that I have just outlined for all of you. But Article 5, of course, applies to NATO allies, of which they're not one. That being said, that doesn't mean that we only support countries who are NATO allies. It doesn't mean we only support countries where we have an exact, specific international obligation to. So I don't have any legal definition for you, but I think the range of assistance we've provided speaks to our commitment to the future of Ukraine.
Does the fact that there is no bilateral security agreement restrict necessarily what the U.S. government can do?
I'd Roz, for legal questions on military assistance, I'd point you to the Department of Defense.
You have given Ukraine security assurances in the past when they gave up their nuclear weapons in the 1990s
Sure.
and their nuclear material. You talked about in a document that was legally binding, ensuring their territorial and security integrity.
Yes, we have.
But
So how do you
right
put
now,
that
it's
into
not
practice?
happening, correct? I mean, their territory has been clearly violated, and they're losing territory control, both politically and militarily.
Well, I think the steps Russia has taken, I don't think we've held our fire on our concerns about that, nor have we held back on providing assistance in a range of capacities to Ukraine. There's not a new, I'm of course familiar with the history, but to Roz's question, there's not a new military arrangement. You'd be aware of that certainly, but for any legal historical questions on military assistance, I'd point you to the Department of
But
Defense.
there is an implied promise under those guarantees after Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, what is the U.S. required to do?
Again, Roz, I don't think I'm going to have more for you on this. Do we have any more on Ukraine?
Yeah, from the
Go ahead.
podium, you referred to Russia's actions as a direct intervention yesterday. You called it an incursion, but Ukraine is already calling it an invasion. So why haven't you referred to it as an invasion?
Well, Ali, I think our focus is more on what Russia is doing, what we're going to do about it, than what we're calling it. What they're doing is an incursion, as you said. It's a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. It is, an issue that, regardless of what it's called, Russia's actions need to stop. There's not a legal, there's no new set of obligations based on that kind of terminology. So we're just more focused on what they're doing and what we're going to do about it.
Okay, and then just following up on what Arsha mentioned, the fact that NATO has identified 1,000 Russian troops, is it correct that the United States does not agree with that assessment right now, of that number of troops?
We have no reason to doubt their assessment. We just don't have any independent confirmation or additional details from here. Go ahead.
A few moments ago, you indicated that the United States and its European allies are awaiting a choice by Mr. Putin, a better choice. I wonder if, from where you sit, this insertion of combat forces, surface-to-air missile systems, artillery batteries, and the like, doesn't in fact constitute Mr. Putin's choice. Hasn't he made his choice, in effect?
Well, at no point have we been, quote, awaiting a choice. There's always been a choice and an off-ramp that has existed from the beginning of this conflict. So certainly, as I've noted a couple of times, we are concerned about the pattern of escalating aggression that we've seen not just over the past couple of days, but weeks and months. This is not a new pattern of behavior, I think, is the important point here. So it's not, and again, because there's ongoing discussions in the administration and with our NATO partners and with the UN and with the OSCE, it's clear no one's waiting to have discussions, but there's long been an off-ramp that President Putin could choose.
Since you have been saying for several months that Mr. Putin and the Russian Federation will be made to absorb greater costs if they continue to escalate the situation, and since you have identified a steady pattern of escalation, and since the forms of escalation haven't themselves been novel, but rather within the range you might have expected, why isn't it that you cannot very swiftly begin imposing those costs now that he has continued to escalate the situation, in your view?
Well, we've imposed a range of costs over the course of the last several months. We at first did individual sanctions, we did visa bans, we escalated it and did increase sanctions in the form of targeted banks and different companies that would impact Russia in a more significant way. And we worked with our European partners. Those are all being implemented. So our consequences and costs have increased over the course of time, just as theirs have.
But now that we have seen a market escalation from where you sit in the form of infiltration of combat forces, military systems, and direct fighting by the Russian forces inside the territory of Ukraine, that, it would seem, marks a significant new escalation of the kind that you have been vowing for months now to punish with swift, harsher costs. Why are those costs not immediately deployed?
Well, James, I think factually, I think it's important to remember that we've had concerns for weeks now about Russia crossing over the border, about the provisions and assistance that they've been providing to the separatists.
That speaks to my point, then. You've had weeks, then, to inflict these added costs.
And we've put in place sanctions and additional sanctions and increased that over the course of time. That discussion is constantly ongoing, not only within the administration, but as you know, the UN has a meeting this afternoon. There was an emergency OSCE meeting. This will be discussed through international fora as well. So I don't have anything to predict for you, but these discussions are ongoing, and these emergency meetings are being pulled together in part because of the range of actions that are taking place.
Two final questions. You've been very kind. Insofar as the U.S. seems to imply that the imposition of cost could become so great at some point that Mr. Putin will be compelled or feel compelled to make a different set of choices, it would seem that the United States regards Vladimir Putin as a rational actor on the world stage, one that can be directed to make certain rational choices in response to external stimuli. Is that so? Do we regard Vladimir Putin as a rational actor on the world stage?
Well, I welcome and appreciate the opportunity to give further definitions to Mr. Putin, but I'm not going to bite that. But I will say that President Putin is somebody who's clearly made choices that are illegal, that are escalatory, that are against the international accepted approach to dealing with your neighbors, and that's why we have put costs in place. Now, we can't predict his actions, nor can we get into his brain and understand his motivations, so I'm not going to do psychoanalysis, but we're watching this closely because we don't know what he will do. And what we're responding to are the actions that are being taken and the events that we're seeing, and that's why we've put these costs in place.
One related and final separate question. Is it the view of the United States government that Mr. Putin, within his own system, holds all the power he would need to hold in order to make what you regard as the correct choices? Or, in fact, do you regard that Mr. Putin is an actor within a system, in his own system, facing constraints of one kind or another from institutional blocs or other forces within the Russian Federation? Or does he operate with complete autonomy?
Well, I think our view is that if President Putin wanted to go down a bit different path, he has the power to do that.
Can I just follow up on
Sure.
My colleague's line of questioning?
Mm-hmm.
Given that the goal of sanctions and the other tools that you have and can use is to change President Putin's behavior, wouldn't it be smarter to use those tools while he's in the midst of the action and not weeks afterward, like you did in Crimea, like you did after he started supporting separatist activity in Donetsk and Luhansk? If the goal is to change his behavior, he's doing it now. Why wait and have internal discussions for many days and weeks when you could, make that choice more easy for him now?
Well, the discussions are ongoing. They don't stop and start. There are discussions that happen within the administration and with the UN and other international bodies about what the next steps would be, should they be needed. I would dispute the notion that every time we've announced sanctions, it's been days or weeks after a specific event. I think it's been faster than that in most occasions, but also we've seen a series of events, so there isn't just two events that we're looking at that we're then responding to.
But I think it's surprising that you have, it's incongruous for us, I think, to hear you decrying what is, for all intents and purposes, an invasion or whatever, an intervention, and you're still saying more steps if they are needed. How can you say at this point they are not needed? If the goal was to avert such activity and he's now done it, shouldn't he incur more costs?
Well, certainly, Brad, but I don't want to make a prediction of a decision that hasn't yet been made, so I was trying to be careful in my diplomatic speak from the podium.
Can we say that you would expect more action against Russia after this, even if the form and nature of that hasn't been decided?
I would just say that obviously discussions are ongoing about what additional steps we may or may not decide to take.
Can I ask one last one?
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. Given the actions that have occurred to this point, given the reactions and the costs that have been imposed to this point, and given the continued pattern of escalatory behavior that you discern, shouldn't the United States government, as a simple matter of rational analysis, be prepared to acknowledge that there may in fact be no set of economic sanctions that can be imposed that would deter Mr. Putin from his present course?
I think we have to see what options are effective, what more we can do, not just the United States, but with the European community. As I mentioned before, our focus is on non-lethal assistance and obviously using diplomatic tools, but we haven't ruled out other options either.
But you cannot rule out that there may in fact be no set of economic sanctions that will achieve what you're seeking them to achieve, correct?
Well,
As a matter of rational analysis, that's plausible,
we can't
correct?
predict what will provoke President Putin to change his behavior. However, our view is that significant impact on the economy in his own country, a country that he says he loves, should have an impact. Sure.
I made a mistake in something I said. I said that a NATO spokesman had said that there were about 1,000. In fact, it was an unnamed NATO officer who said there were well over 1,000 Russian soldiers in Ukraine.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you for noting that.
I
Do we have any more in Ukraine?
One last one.
Go ahead.
In terms of the multiple tools the U.S. has to influence Moscow, has the United States ever considered making an agreement with Russia to de-escalate that involves an ironclad declaration that Ukraine will not be part of NATO?
I just don't have any more details to discuss with you. I would say our focus is more on encouraging Russia and Ukraine to have a discussion about where things should go moving forward. But broadly speaking, a decision about who should be a member of NATO is not for the United States to make. It's for NATO countries to make together. So I would encourage you to note that.
But surely if the United States makes the argument and makes a promise or an assurance that that wouldn't be the case, that they wouldn't be a NATO member, that would go a long way. It's not as if the United States isn't an influential member of that group.
We certainly are a vital member of NATO, but we don't have anything more on that question.
I thought it was the policy of the U.S. government that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, and that was the formulation that was agreed to at a NATO summit, and I'm embarrassed to say I'm forgetting the year, but it was during the administration of George W. Bush, that's your policy. Ukraine will be a member of NATO.
Well, there's a process, as you know. There are many countries that have to take steps in order to meet the requirements that NATO lays out. So that's what I was referring to. Go ahead.
Syria.